March 14th, 1943. 7 minutes, that's all it took. 73 shells, 51 direct hits, 94 men dead, 17 survived. The Japanese thought the American 5-inch gun was a joke, a weapon designed to shoot airplanes useless against submarines hiding in the depths where steel met darkness and men breathed recycled air that tasted like fear and diesel fuel. They were wrong. In 6 months, this dismissed weapon would kill 1,500 Japanese submariners. Not in the depths they trusted, but on the surface they feared, where the sky was wide open and American guns could see them clearly, where there was nowhere to hide and nowhere to run, and 30 seconds felt like 30 years, when shells were falling like steel rain. This is the story of how American destroyer crews turned a forgotten gun into the most lethal anti-submarine weapon in the Pacific War. How 6 young men from farms and factories and street corners became the most efficient submarine hunters in naval history, and how the hunters became the hunted. But here's what the history books won't tell you. In early 1943, American anti-submarine warfare was a disaster. 470 attacks, 7 kills. That's a success rate of 1.5%. Less than 2 out of every 100 attempts. Japanese submarine commanders laughed at American destroyers. They'd surface at night, recharge batteries, repair equipment, breathe fresh air, and disappear before dawn. American sonar couldn't track them through thermal layers and biological noise. American depth charges couldn't reach them in the deep water where they hid like ghosts in a graveyard. Then everything changed. One ship, one weapon, one tactic that the Japanese never saw coming. You're about to witness how American ingenuity, courage, and a gun, everyone dismissed, transformed naval warfare forever. How a 22-year-old farm boy from Nebraska tracked submarines through hundreds of explosions that would have deafened lesser men. How a Puerto Rican boxer turned his gun crew into a killing machine, firing 19 rounds per minute, when regulations said 15 was impossible. And how a 35-year-old commander with eyes like winter ice broke every rule in the book and won. If you or your father served in the Pacific during World War II, this story will hit close to home. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you watch the war from. Whether from the deck of a ship with salt spray in your face and fear in your belly, a factory back home building the weapons that would end it, or through the eyes of a child waiting for dad to come back, counting the days on a calendar with small, desperate marks. Now let's go back to where it all began. January 1943, 6,000 miles from home off the coast of San Francisco, where the water was cold and black and full of secrets, a Japanese submarine commander sat in his conning tower reading a letter from his pregnant wife. The paper was thin, almost translucent, covered in delicate brushstrokes that carried her voice across an ocean and a war. His name was Commander Takeshi Yamada, 28 years old. Graduate of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, top of his class, first in tactics, first in navigation, first in everything that mattered when steel met steel and men died in the dark. A thin scar ran from his right ear to his chin, a souvenir from a training accident in 1940 that had nearly ended his career before it began. Veteran of Pearl Harbor, where he'd watched Arizona explode and felt nothing but professional satisfaction at a mission accomplished. Yamada commanded submarine WWII-26. 2,000 tons of steel, 6 torpedo tubes loaded with Type 95 torpedoes that carried 550 pounds of high explosive, and a crew of 94 men who believed they were unstoppable. Warriors of the deep, samurai of the sea, invisible predators in an ocean that belonged to them. And why wouldn't they believe it? In the first year of war, Japanese submarines operated with near impunity. They shelled the California coast, sending civilians running inland with stories of enemy warships materializing from fog like vengeful ghosts. They sank merchant ships off Hawaii, watching through periscopes as men jumped into burning oil slicks and disappeared. They hunted American warships from Alaska to Australia, from the Arctic Circle to the Great Barrier Reef. And everywhere they went, American destroyers tried to stop them. They failed. Yamada kept a journal. Black leather, small enough to fit in his jacket pocket, pages filled with precise observations and careful handwriting. In it, he wrote something that would prove tragically ironic just 5 months later. But to understand why his words would haunt the Imperial Japanese Navy, why they would be read in emergency meetings in Tokyo with growing horror, You need to know what American destroyers were like in early 1943. Picture this. You're a sonar operator on an American destroyer, 20 years old maybe, fresh from training school, where they taught you the basics in 6 weeks and sent you to war, hoping you'd learn the rest before it killed you. Your equipment can barely detect a submarine beyond 1,000 yards. That's half a mile. Less than the distance from your house to the corner store. The submarine you're hunting can hear you coming from 3 times that distance. They have better sonar, better training, better everything. By the time you detect them, they've already dove to 150 meters, 490 feet, deeper than your depth charges can reach, deeper than light penetrates, deeper than hope. The math was brutal. To sink a submarine, your 300-pound depth charge had to explode within 25 feet of the hull, 25 feet in an ocean 3 miles deep, while the submarine is maneuvering at 8 knots, zigging and zagging like a running deer. While your own propeller noise blinds your sonar, filling your headphones with the sound of your own ship, your own failure. While the submarine commander, who is not stupid, who graduated at the top of his class, just like Yamada, takes every evasive action his training and experience suggest. The statistics tell the story. 470 attacks in 1942, 7 confirmed kills. For every 100 attacks, 98.5 submarines escaped unharmed, untouched, laughing. So when Commander Yamada wrote in his journal on January 15, 1943, he had every reason to be confident. The entry was brief, clinical, the observations of a professional observer. American destroyers detected our presence 3 times during our approach to San Francisco. Each time, we simply dove to 150 meters and changed course. Their depth charges detonated far behind our position, distant thuds that shook the hull, but caused no damage. Their sonar could not track us at depth, could not penetrate the thermal layers we hid beneath like blankets. We surfaced after dark and continued our mission without difficulty. American destroyers are blind children in the dark. We are ghosts they cannot catch. Yamada wasn't arrogant. He was right. Based on everything he'd experienced, based on every encounter with American anti-submarine forces, American anti-submarine warfare was a joke. A dangerous joke that occasionally got lucky, but a joke nonetheless. His wife Akiko was 7 months pregnant with their first child, a daughter. They'd already chosen the name during his last leave, sitting in their small house in Yokosuka while cherry blossoms fell like snow outside the window. Emiko, beautiful blessing, a name full of hope. Yamada fully expected to meet his daughter. He had no reason to think otherwise. He'd survived Pearl Harbor, survived a dozen patrols, survived encounters with American destroyers that were more comedy than combat. He would survive this war, return home, hold his daughter, watch her grow. The future stretched before him like a calm sea. What Yamada didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that 300 miles south, a young American farm boy was about to change everything. Robert Hendricks was 22 years old, 5'9", 140 pounds, soaking wet, thin as a fence post, and twice as stubborn. Thick glasses that made him look like the accountant he'd planned to become before Pearl Harbor. A small burn scar marked his left hand where he'd grabbed a hot exhaust pipe on a tractor when he was 14. Before the world caught fire and farm boys from Nebraska put on uniforms and went to sea, he was from a town so small it barely appeared on maps. Population 300, 1 church, 1 school, 1 general store that sold everything from nails to candy. His entire life, the loudest sound he'd heard was a tractor engine on a quiet morning when sound carried for miles across flat land. Now he sat in a steel box beneath the waterline of a destroyer, wearing headphones that hurt his ears, listening for submarines in an ocean that was never quiet, never still, never simple. And he was terrible at it. January 1943, 4th failed contact in a month. The submarine had slipped away again, disappearing into the deep water like smoke and wind. Hendricks sat alone in the sonar room, after his watch ended, rewinding the tape, listening to where he'd lost it. Listening to the moment when the contact had been strong and clear, and then suddenly wasn't. Trying to understand what he'd done wrong, trying to figure out how to do better next time. The sonar room was cramped, barely large enough for 2 men to stand without touching. Banks of equipment lined the walls, glowing dials and spinning reels and switches whose functions he was still learning. The air smelled like electricity and sweat and failure. His buddy Seaman Tommy Patterson stuck his head through the hatch. Patterson was from Chicago, loud and confident, and good at everything Hendricks struggled with. He looked at Hendricks hunched over the tape recorder, headphones half on, and grinned the way people grin when they know they're being cruel but don't care. "Hey, farm boy, maybe you should go back to listening to coos instead of submarines. At least cows don't fight back." The other men in the passageway laughed. Not cruel laughter exactly, but not kind either. The laughter of tired men finding humor where they could, even if it meant stepping on someone who was already down. The worst part was Hendricks couldn't even argue. Patterson was right. He was terrible at this. 4 contacts lost. 4 submarines that got away clean, probably laughing at the farm boy who couldn't tell a submarine from a whale, couldn't maintain contact, couldn't do the one job he'd been trained to do. But that night alone in his bunk in the berthing compartment where 100 men slept in racks, stacked 3 high, Hendricks made a decision. He pulled out a notebook, one of the small ones the Navy issued for taking notes during training, and wrote by flashlight while the ship rolled gently beneath him and other men snored and muttered in their sleep. "Next time I won't lose them. I don't care if I have to stay at that station 20 hours straight. I don't care if my ears bleed from the headphones. I don't care if I go deaf. Next time I keep contact. Next time I don't fail." Hendricks didn't know it yet, sitting there in the dark, writing promises to himself. But that determination would lead him to track a submarine through 8 massive underwater explosions that would have destroyed the hearing of a lesser man. Would lead him to maintain contact for 7 critical minutes while the ocean exploded around him and men died. Would lead him to kill 94 men whose names he would never know, whose faces he would never see, but whose deaths would mark him forever. But first he needed better equipment, and that equipment was on its way. USS Fletcher, hull number D445, was different from every destroyer that came before, different in ways that would change naval warfare, different in ways the Japanese wouldn't understand until it was too late. 376 feet long, 2,500 tons displacement, top speed 38 knots, fast enough to catch anything that floated, and most things that flew. But the real revolution wasn't the hull or the engines or the speed, it was what she carried. 5 Mark 12 5-inch guns mounted in single turrets. Dual-purpose weapons designed to shoot down aircraft at high angles and engage enemy ships at flat trajectories. Each gun could fire a shell weighing 55 pounds to a maximum range of 18,000 yards, 9 nautical miles. Far enough to hit targets over the horizon if the fire control was good enough. Rate of fire was 15 to 20 rounds per minute per gun, depending on crew proficiency, depending on how well trained they were, how hard they'd practiced, how much they wanted it. With 5 guns, a Fletcher could put 75 to 100 rounds in the air every minute. 75 projectiles, each one capable of punching through steel plate, each one carrying 7 pounds of high explosive, each one a death sentence if it hit the right place. The Japanese looked at these guns and laughed. A captured Japanese intelligence report from February 1943, recovered after the war from a filing cabinet in Tokyo, literally states in black and white official language, "American destroyer main battery poses no threat to submerged operations. Surface weapons, anti-aircraft weapons, useless against submarines that operated underwater where guns couldn't reach." The Japanese were about to learn a very expensive lesson about American ingenuity, about what happened when you underestimated men who'd grown up fixing tractors and cars and anything else that broke. Men who looked at problems and saw solutions. Men who didn't care what the manual said if there was a better way. The man who would teach them that lesson was Commander William Brennan. 35 years old, prematurely, gray eyes, the color of winter sky that never wavered, never showed doubt. His crew called him Ice. Not because he was cold, though he could be colder than a Nebraska winter when the situation called for it, but because nothing rattled him. Not weather, not combat, not casualty reports, nothing. Brennan was a veteran of the Atlantic where he'd hunted German U-boats with the British Royal Navy before America entered the war. He'd seen what worked and what didn't. He'd seen British destroyers use tactics that American commanders dismissed as too risky, too unorthodox, too likely to fail. He'd seen those tactics succeed. His wife Sarah had died in a car accident in 1941, 3 weeks before Pearl Harbor. No children, no family except the Navy. The ship was all he had left, and he poured everything into it. Every lesson learned, every innovation studied, every tactical advantage that might keep his men alive and kill the enemy faster. And he'd read something in a classified British report that the U.S. Navy had dismissed as impractical, filed away in some basement archive where inconvenient ideas went to die. Force the submarine to surface with depth charges, then destroy it with gunfire before it can dive again. The theory was sound elegant even. Submarines were vulnerable on the surface. Their deck guns were small, 3 or 4 inches at most, meant for engaging merchant ships, not warships. Their armor was non-existent. A shell traveling at 2,500 feet per second would punch through a submarine's pressure hull like tissue paper, would penetrate deep into the interior spaces, would explode in mod where men worked and lived and breathed, would turn the submarine into a steel coffin in seconds. The challenge was timing. You had maybe 30 seconds after surfacing before the submarine could crash dive again. 30 seconds to acquire the target. Aim 5 guns, fire 75 rounds. Hit a moving target the size of a football field that was trying very hard not to be hit. Most commanders thought it was impossible. The human factor, they said. Too many variables. Too much that could go wrong. Better to stick with depth charges with tactics that were proven even if they rarely worked. Better to fail the old way than risk failure trying something new. Commander Brennan knew it was possible. He'd seen the math. He'd run the calculations. He'd studied the problem from every angle and reached a conclusion that was cold and clear and unavoidable. He just had to prove it. If Brennan was going to prove his theory, turn his calculations into reality, he needed the best gun crew in the Pacific Fleet. Men who could load and aim and fire faster than anyone thought possible. Men who wouldn't hesitate when the moment came. Men who understood that in combat, the difference between 15 rounds per minute and 20 rounds per minute was the difference between life and death. He found his man in Petty Officer Daniel Torres. Danny Torres, 24 years old, 5'7", 160 pounds, pure muscle wrapped tight over a frame that looked too small to carry the weight of what he'd done and what he'd do. Puerto Rican by birth, American by choice, and the Pacific Fleet lightweight boxing champion by knockout. 3 fights, 3 wins, all in the first round. Men who'd boxed him said it was like fighting a hurricane that could think. A tattoo of a rocket decorated his left forearm, gotten on Liberty in San Diego the day after Pearl Harbor. Torres was gun captain for Mount 51, the forward 5-inch gun. The gun that fired first that set the pace for the other 4. And he ran his crew like a prize fight trainer preparing champions. Hard, relentless, demanding excellence because anything less got you killed. The gun crew assembled on deck every morning at 0600 before the sun broke the horizon and turned the ocean from black to blue. 5 men. Torres, the gun captain. Jimmy Chen, the loader. 18 years old, barely looked 16, arms like sticks when he first arrived. Mike Sullivan, the pointer who controlled elevation. Jack Morrison, the trainer who controlled azimuth. Pete Williams, the sight setter who calculated range and fuse settings. Torres drilled them 12 hours a day. Morning drills before breakfast. Afternoon drills in the heat when the deck was hot enough to burn through boot soles. Night drills under searchlights that turned everything harsh and strange. Standard rate of fire for a 5-inch gun was 15 rounds per minute. Regulations said that was the maximum, the theoretical limit of what human beings could achieve with shells that weighed as much as a small child in manual loading. Torres demanded 18. The crew thought he was insane. They said it couldn't be done. They said the regulations existed for a reason. They said human beings had limits. Torres didn't care what they said. He'd watched his 17-year-old brother die at Pearl Harbor, watched Arizona explode while his brother Rafael was trapped inside, and that changed a man, made him understand that limits were negotiable. That impossible was just a word people used when they hadn't tried hard enough. Load, aim, fire, faster. You think that submarine's gonna wait for you? You got 30 seconds before she dives and kills every man on this ship. 30 seconds to kill her or die. There's no third option, no middle ground, no participation trophy. You live or you die based on how fast you are. The crew practiced until their hands bled, until their shoulders screamed from lifting shells, until they could do it in their sleep, could do it blind, could do it under any conditions, because Torres wouldn't accept less than perfection. Jimmy Chen was the youngest, 18, the youngest on the crew, maybe the youngest on the ship. His parents ran a laundry in San Francisco, working 16-hour days, 6 days a week to build something for their children. Chen had lied about his age to enlist after hearing about the Bataan Death March, after seeing photos in the newspaper that made him understand what this war was really about. He was terrified of combat, of failure, of letting Torres down, of letting his family down, of being the weak link that got everyone killed. The first time Torres handed him a shell, Chen could barely lift it. His arms shook, his back bent. The shell wobbled and Torres had to grab it before it fell. Torres could have yelled, could have cursed, could have sent Chen back to wherever scared kids went when they couldn't do the job. Instead, he put the shell down gently and looked Chen in the eyes. It's not about strength, Jimmy. It's about rhythm. Load, swing, ram. Like dancing, like breathing. Watch me, Torres demonstrated, made it look easy, effortless, like the shell weighed nothing. Then he handed it to Chen again. Again. Chen struggled, dropped it, tried again, again. Days became weeks, weeks became months. Chen's arms got stronger, his technique got better. The rhythm that Torres talked about became real, became something Chen could feel in his muscles and bones. By March 1943, Chen could load 19 rounds per minute. The fastest loader in the Pacific Fleet, faster than men twice his size, faster than regulations said was possible. He still didn't know that in 2 weeks he'd load 38 shells in 2 minutes that would kill 94 men. That his speed, his perfection, his refusal to fail would make him part of something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He didn't know that the shells he loaded would penetrate submarine hulls and explode inside where men were trying to abandon ship. That he'd hear later about bodies torn apart by shrapnel, about compartments flooding in seconds, about men drowning in darkness while their shipmates screamed. He was just a kid who wanted to do his job well, wanted to make Torres proud, wanted to prove that the scared boy who could barely lift a shell had become a man who could do impossible things. March 13, 1943. Fletcher received orders that would change everything. Patrol 15 miles northeast of Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides. Intelligence reported Japanese submarine activity in the area. Multiple contacts, multiple threats. Commander Brennan gathered his officers in the wardroom, small space table bolted to the deck chairs that didn't match. The kind of room where decisions got made that would ripple across oceans and decades. He didn't waste time with preambles or speeches. That wasn't his style. Gentlemen, if we make contact tomorrow, we're not doing this the old way. We're going to force them up with depth charges, and when they surface, we're going to kill them with the main battery. 5-inch guns, maximum rate of fire, continuous fire until the target sinks. Questions, silence. The kind of silence that fills rooms when men realize something significant is happening, but aren't sure what it means yet. No one questioned Commander Brennan, ever. His reputation preceded him. His record spoke for itself. If he said they were going to kill submarines with surface guns, then that's what they were going to do. At 0300 hours, March 14th, Robert Hendricks took his position in the sonar room. 2 hours before dawn, the ocean was dark and cold and full of things that wanted to kill him. He'd been at his station for 2 hours listening to the endless static and biological noise that filled the ocean when he heard it. A sound different from everything else. Different from whales and dolphins and shrimp. Different from thermal layers and current shear. Different from the 1,000 natural sounds that filled the sea. Something metallic. Something large. Something moving with purpose through water 2,000 yards away. Hendricks' heart rate jumped. His hands went to the controls without conscious thought. His training took over muscle memory from thousands of hours of practice. Contact. Bearing 027, range 1,800 yards. Designate probable submarine. His voice was steady even though his hands were shaking. Even though this was it, the moment he'd been training for, the moment that would prove whether he was good enough or just another farm boy who couldn't do the job. For the next 7 minutes, everything would change. The ocean would explode. Men would die. History would pivot on decisions made in seconds by young men who'd never imagined they'd carry such weight. And Robert Hendricks, the farm boy from Nebraska, who'd been terrible at this job just 2 months ago, would track a submarine through hell itself and never lose contact. What happened next would shock the Japanese Imperial Navy, would revolutionize anti-submarine warfare, would haunt Robert Hendricks for the rest of his life. But first we need to understand what was happening below the surface, in the submarine that was about to die. Among the 94 men who had minutes left to live and didn't know it yet, Submarine I-2, March 14th, 1943, 03:45 hours, 120 feet below the surface where sunlight never reached and the pressure could crush a man's skull like an eggshell. 94 men lived in a steel tube 300 feet long and 30 feet wide. They'd been at sea for 18 days. 18 days of breathing air that had been recycled through scrubbers until it tasted like metal and chemicals, and the collective exhalation of too many bodies in too small a space. 18 days of sleeping in bunks stacked three high with barely enough room to turn over. 18 days of the constant hum of machinery and the creak of steel under pressure, and the knowledge that between them in the crushing depths was nothing but riveted plates and prayers. The air was thick, heavy. It smelled like diesel fuel that had soaked into every surface, into clothing and skin and hair. It smelled like unwashed bodies because fresh water was precious, reserved for drinking, and the batteries that kept them alive. It smelled like the fear that no one acknowledged but everyone carried. In the electrical compartment aft near the stern, where the propeller shafts ran through the hull in sealed bearings that sometimes leaked, Seaman Yoshiro Tanaka was fixing a circuit breaker that kept shorting out. The problem was intermittent, the worst kind. It would work fine for hours and then suddenly trip, plunging his section into darkness and stopping whatever equipment relied on that circuit. He'd replaced the breaker twice already. This time he was going deeper, checking the wiring itself for damage. 24 years old, but looked younger. Baby-faced even with the beginnings of a beard that came in patchy and uneven. From a farming village in Hokkaido, so small it didn't have a name, just a number on a regional map that no one outside the prefecture had ever seen. His father had died when Tanaka was 12, kicked by a horse, internal bleeding, dead before the doctor could arrive from the next village over. His mother was raising three younger siblings alone on a farm that barely produced enough to feed them. Tanaka sent 80% of his Navy pay home every month, 20 yen. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep his youngest sister in school, to buy seeds for spring planting, to fix the roof before winter. In his pocket, folded carefully in a waterproof wrapper, he carried two things. A letter from his mother written in her careful hand talking about the weather and the crops and his sister's progress in school, saying nothing about the hardship, but revealing it in what she didn't say. And a photograph of Keiko, the girl next door, who'd promised to wait for him. 17 years old, traditional dress, shy smile eyes that looked at the camera like she was looking at a future that included him. Tanaka dreamed of opening an electrical shop when the war ended. A small place in town, maybe in Sapporo if he could save enough. Fixing radios and installing wiring and building a life that didn't smell like diesel and fear. Maybe marrying Keiko. Having children, growing old, simple dreams, good dreams. He had 17 minutes left to live. He didn't know that, had no way of knowing that. He was just a man fixing a circuit breaker, thinking about home, counting the days until his patrol ended and he could write another letter, send another 20 yen, stay connected to a world that felt increasingly distant. I-2's commander, Lieutenant Commander Hiro Sakamoto, was in the conning tower reviewing patrol reports by the dim red light that preserved night vision. 52 years old, career Navy, 23 years of service that had taken him from midshipman to commander, from peacetime exercises to the largest war in human history. He was old for a submarine commander. Most were in their 30s, young enough to handle the physical demands and the stress. But Sakamoto was good, very good. 2 commendations for bravery, 3 for tactical excellence. He knew these waters better than most men knew their own neighborhoods. He'd sunk 3 American merchant ships in January. Watched them through the periscope as they burned and sank, felt professional satisfaction at torpedoes launched and targets destroyed. Shelled an airfield in February, putting 12 rounds into fuel storage tanks and watching them explode. This patrol was supposed to be routine reconnaissance, chart American ship movements, gather intelligence, avoid contact unless targets of opportunity presented themselves. Sakamoto believed, like Yamada, like most submarine commanders in the Imperial Japanese Navy, that American destroyers were a nuisance but not a threat. Dangerous if you were careless, harmless if you followed proper procedure. Dive deep, change course, wait them out. They'd exhaust their depth charges and leave frustrated and defeated. It had worked a dozen times, 24, more than that. Every patrol, every encounter, American destroyers were predictable, limited, blind. He was about to learn differently. At 0345, I-2's sonar operator, a thin man named Sato who'd been doing this job for 3 years and was good at it, heard something that made his blood run cold. A sound he'd heard before, but never this clear, never this focused. Active sonar, American active sonar. The distinct ping of a destroyer broadcasting sound into the water and listening for echoes. Looking for submarines. Looking for them. Captain American Destroyer Range, 2,000 meters. They have active contact. Sato's voice was high-tight with stress. Around the control room, men looked up from their stations. The casual atmosphere evaporated. Suddenly, everyone was alert, focused, waiting for orders. Sakamoto's mind raced through options. They were at 120 feet, safe depth. Standard procedure was simple, practice proven. Dive deeper, change course. Slow to silent running speed. Wait for the destroyer to give up and leave. He'd done it before. It would work again. Dive to 150 meters. Come left to heading 090. Slow to 4 knots. Rig for silent running. His voice was calm, professional. The voice of a man who'd been here before and knew what to do. Around him, men moved to execute his orders with practiced efficiency. The submarine nose down. The deck tilted beneath their feet at a gentle angle. The diving planes bit into the water, forcing I-2 deeper into the cold dark below. Standard procedure, it had worked a dozen times, but 300 feet above Robert Hendricks was not a standard sonar operator. Not anymore. 2 months of drilling, 2 months of listening to tapes until he could identify every sound the ocean made. 2 months of failure and determination and refusal to give up. 2 months of becoming something more than a farm boy who couldn't do the job. Contact turning left, speed decreasing, depth increasing. Contact bearing 024, range 1,500 yards. I've got you, Hendricks whispered to himself to the submarine to the ocean. His eyes were closed. His whole world had narrowed to the sound in his headphones. The distinctive echo of steel reflecting sound. The pattern that was uniquely submarine, uniquely threat, uniquely target. For the first time in his life, Hendricks didn't lose contact. Above him on the bridge, Commander Brennan stood watching the ocean surface with binoculars waiting for information from below. The sky was starting to lighten in the east. Dawn was coming. In an hour, the ocean would be visible. The hunt would be easier. But an hour was a long time in submarine warfare. The voice tube from the sonar room crackled. Captain Sonar reports solid contact. Bearing 024, range 1,400 yards. Contact is evading, but we're maintaining track. Brennan allowed himself a small smile. Hendricks was doing it. The farm boy was actually doing it, maintaining contact through evasive maneuvers that would have shaken any other sonar operator in the fleet. All ahead flank, set depth charges for 100 and 150 feet. K-guns stand by. His voice was calm, matter of fact, like he was ordering coffee, not preparing to kill nearly 100 men. Around him, the bridge crew moved with purpose. Below decks, depth charge crews ran to their stations. Gun crews prepared weapons that might not be needed, but would be ready if they were. Fletcher surged forward. The twin screws bit into the water. The bow wave grew higher, white water cascading over the forecastle. 20 knots, 25, 30. The destroyer accelerated like a hunting animal closing on prey. In the sonar room, Hendricks called out bearings continuously. His voice was steady now, confident, the voice of a man who knew his job and was doing it well. Contact bearing 023, range 1,000. Bearing 023, range 800. Bearing 022, range 600. Each bearing update was a nail in I-2's coffin. Each range call-out brought Fletcher closer to the moment when depth charges would fall, and the ocean would explode and men would die. At 400 yards, Brennan gave the order. Fire K-guns. Drop depth charges. 6 K-guns fired simultaneously with sharp metallic cracks that echoed across the water. 6 300-pound depth charges arced through the air in ballistic trajectories 150 feet on either side of Fletcher's track. They looked small, almost harmless. Dark cylinders tumbling through space. They weren't harmless. 2 seconds later, charges rolled off the stern racks. The ship had passed over the submarine's estimated position. The charges tumbled into Fletcher's wake, into the white water and turbulence, and began their descent. 8 charges total, 4 set for 100 feet, 4 set for 150 feet. Enough high explosive to kill a submarine if they were close enough. Enough to damage one if they were near. Enough to terrify the men inside even if they were too far away to cause structural harm. The charges fell through water that got colder and darker with every foot of descent. Fell past schools of fish that scattered at their passage. Fell through thermal layers and in current shear, and all the complexity of an ocean that was never simple, never predictable. In 20 seconds, they would detonate. Inside, I2 Tanaka was tightening the last screw on the circuit breaker when he heard the depth charges hitting the water above. The sound carried through the hull. Distinct splashes. 1, 2, 3, 4. A pause, 5, 6, 7, 8. He looked up. His hands stopped moving. Around him, the electrical compartment had gone silent. Everyone had heard it. Everyone knew what it meant. The veteran electrician next to him, a man named Ito, who'd survived 4 depth charge attacks, went pale. His hands gripped a support beam. Brace, brace. The first charge exploded 50 feet from I2's stern. The sound was beyond anything Tanaka had imagined. Not just loud, beyond loud. A physical force that hit the submarine like a giant fist punching steel. The hull rang like a bell. Equipment jumped off tables. Lights flickered and went out. Men were thrown off their feet. The shock wave propagated through water and steel, through the pressure hull that was designed to keep crushing ocean pressure out but couldn't stop pressure waves from coming in, through bulkheads and frames and equipment mounts. Tanaka was thrown against a switchboard. His head hit a valve. Blood ran into his eyes, hot and sticky. The world went gray at the edges. The second charge exploded, closer, 30 feet. The submarine shook like a tin can in a washing machine. Pipes burst. Water sprayed from a dozen places. Alarm bells started ringing, automatic systems detecting damage and flooding and failure. Men were screaming. Tanaka couldn't hear them over the ringing in his ears, but he could see their mouths open, see the terror on their faces. Could see the veteran electrician Ito holding onto the support beam with white knuckles, eyes squeezed shut, lips moving in prayer. Third explosion, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, one after another with barely enough time to process one before the next hit. The submarine was being pummeled by explosions that turned the ocean into a hammer and I2 into an anvil. Every explosion brought new damage, new leaks, new failures. In the control room, Sakamoto fought to maintain depth, fought to keep the submarine under control. But control was slipping away like water through fingers. Damage report, can we maintain depth? He had to shout to be heard over the chaos, over the alarm bells and the rushing water and the screams of injured men. Hydraulic lines, ruptured dive planes not responding. We're broaching, the diving officer's voice cracked on the last word. Broaching, the nightmare scenario. The one thing every submarine commander feared more than depth charges, more than torpedoes, more than anything. It meant the submarine was rising uncontrollably, heading for the surface against the commander's will, heading into the open air where destroyers could see them, where guns could reach them, where there was nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. I2 rose toward the surface. The deck tilted upward at an increasing angle. Men grabbed for handholds. Equipment that wasn't secured slid aft with metallic crashes. Sakamoto knew what was waiting up there. He'd read the intelligence reports. He knew about I-3 and I-17 and the others that had been sunk recently. Knew that American destroyers had developed new tactics. Knew that surfacing meant death. But knowing didn't change anything. The dive planes weren't responding. The hydraulics were gone. The submarine was broaching, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. All hands prepare to abandon ship. It was the hardest order he'd ever given. An admission of defeat. An acknowledgement that his submarine was lost, and all he could do was try to save his crew. On Fletcher's bridge, a lookout whose job was watching the ocean surface shouted the words Brennan had been waiting to hear. Submarine surfacing. Bearing 030, range 1,200 yards. Brennan didn't hesitate. Didn't pause to confirm. Didn't second guess. He'd planned for this moment. Drilled for it. Calculated it. Now it was time to execute. All guns target submarine. Commence firing. In Mount 51, Torres heard the order through his sound-powered phone. Heard it and felt something cold settle into his chest. This was it. The moment all the training had been for. The moment when theory became reality and shells became death. Load armor piercing, range 1200, target submarine conning tower. His crew moved like they'd been doing this for years instead of months. Chen grabbed a shell from the ready rack, swung it into the loading tray with practice motion, rammed it home with the pneumatic rammer. Sullivan adjusted elevation. Morrison trained left. Williams set the fuse for surface burst. 3 seconds from order to ready. 3 seconds of perfect choreography. Fire, the gun roared. The shell accelerated down the barrel at 2,500 feet per second. The recoil shook the mount. The muzzle blast was a physical force. Smoke and fire and thunder. The shell crossed 1,200 yards in 2.8 seconds. I too was halfway through surfacing when the shell arrived. The bow was clear of the water. The conning tower was breaking through. Water streamed from every surface in white cascades. Tanaka had made it to the control room, had seen Sakamoto give the order to abandon ship, had started climbing the ladder toward the conning tower hatch, thinking maybe he'd make it to the surface, maybe he'd survive, maybe he'd see his mother and Keiko again. The first shell hit the conning tower before he reached the hatch. The explosion was different from the depth charges, more focused, more violent. The shell penetrated the thin steel of the conning tower and detonated inside. 7 pounds of high explosive in a confined space. The blast wave tore through the compartment. Shrapnel filled the air like horizontal rain. Tanaka was thrown back down the ladder, landed hard on the deck below, looked up through the hatch and saw that the conning tower was gone. Just gone. Where Sakamoto had been standing, giving orders, there was now twisted metal and fire, and nothing that looked human. The second shell hit. The third, mounts 52 and 53, the wing guns amidships firing in sequence. Both shells hit the pressure hull, one forward of the conning tower, one aft. Each one punched through the steel like it was paper. Each one detonated inside where men were trying to abandon ship, trying to survive, trying to do anything but die. The fourth shell hit. The fifth, Mount 54, Mount 55. Every gun on Fletcher firing at maximum rate. Torres's crew loading and aiming and firing like machines. Chen moving so fast the shells blurred. Sullivan and Morrison tracking the target even as it started to settle in the water. Williams setting fuses with mechanical precision. In the first 15 seconds after surfacing, I too took 5 direct hits, 5 shells, 5 penetrations of the pressure hull, 5 explosions inside the submarine where the blast had nowhere to go but through human bodies and vital equipment. Tanaka couldn't process what was happening. It was too fast, too violent, too far beyond anything his mind could comprehend. The submarine was disintegrating around him. The control room was flooding. Men were dead or dying or screaming. He stumbled aft, survival instinct taking over. Had to get out, had to get to the surface, had to escape this steel coffin before it became his grave. The deck gun crew tried to man their weapon. 4 men running to the 3-inch gun mounted on the forward deck, hoping to return fire, hoping to do something to stop the massacre. They never reached it. Mount 51's second salvo caught them in the open, caught them running across the deck with no protection, no cover, nothing between them and high explosive traveling faster than sound. The shell exploded on contact with the deck. All 4 men died instantly. Didn't suffer. Didn't know what hit them. Just there 1 second and gone the next. Fletcher's guns kept firing. The gun crews had trained for this moment. Trained to fire continuously without pause, without hesitation, without mercy. Now that training paid off in blood and steel. Load fire, load fire, load fire. Torres calling the rhythm. Chen loading faster than regulations said was possible. The automatic loading machinery cycling flawlessly. The entire system working exactly as designed. In 60 seconds, Fletcher's 5 guns fired 73 rounds. 73 shells arcing across 1,200 yards of ocean. 73 trajectories calculated by the Mark 37 fire control director faster than any human could. 73 impacts against a submarine that was 300 feet long and 30 feet wide and couldn't maneuver because it was sinking. 51 shells hit the submarine or exploded close enough to cause fragment damage. The mathematics were overwhelming. The submarine was essentially a stationary target. The fire control computers compensated for range-bearing, ship-motion wind projectile ballistics. With 5 guns firing, even a 50% hit rate would be devastating. But Fletcher's gun crews were achieving better than 70%. They were the best trained gun crews in the Pacific Fleet. They'd practiced against towed targets until they could hit them at any range, against shore targets until they could put shells through windows, against simulated aircraft until they could track targets moving at 200 knots. Now they were firing at a surface submarine that could barely move, at a target that was dying, at men who were trying to abandon ship, trying to swim away, trying to survive. And they weren't missing. I-2 was disintegrating. The conning tower was a shattered wreck of twisted metal. The pressure hull was punctured in at least 20 places. Each hole let in thousands of gallons of water per minute. Each penetration was a death sentence. The submarine couldn't survive this, couldn't be saved, couldn't do anything but sink. Fires burned inside multiple compartments. Electrical fires from damaged wiring, fuel fires from ruptured tanks, fires that consumed oxygen and produced toxic smoke and drove men from spaces they might have saved if they could have stayed. Flooding was uncontrollable. The damage control parties couldn't reach the damaged spaces, couldn't close enough valves to matter, couldn't pump fast enough to overcome the inflow. The submarine was taking on water faster than any pump could remove it. Tanaka reached the aft torpedo room, found the escape hatch. A dozen men were there fighting to open it to get out to reach the surface before the submarine took them down. Someone got the hatch open. Cold seawater poured in. Men started climbing through one at a time as fast as they could move. Tanaka was near the back of the line. He could hear the shells hitting, could feel each impact through the hull, could hear men screaming in compartments forward, could smell smoke and seawater and death. His turn came. He climbed through the hatch into cold water that shocked his system. He was suddenly underwater, disoriented, not sure which way was up. His lungs burned. He kicked, fought toward what he hoped was the surface. His head broke into air. He gasped, breathed, looked around with eyes that stung from salt water and blood. The ocean was full of men, Japanese sailors trying to swim away from the sinking submarine. Some had life jackets, most didn't. Some were injured, struggling to stay afloat. Some were already giving up, slipping beneath the surface, drowning in an ocean that didn't care. Fletcher was still firing. The guns hadn't stopped. Shells were still falling, not at the men in the water, at the submarine, making sure it sank, making sure it couldn't dive again, couldn't escape, couldn't survive. Tanaka watched I-2 roll to starboard, watched water pour into the open hatches, watched his home for the last 18 days, the steel tube that had protected him and nearly killed him, begin its final descent. At 0352, 7 minutes after the first depth charge attack, I-2 sank. The bow went first, tilted down at a steep angle, water rushing in through holes and hatches and the massive wound where the conning tower had been. The stern rose out of the water. The propellers were still turning slowly, bronze blades catching the early morning light. Then the whole submarine slid beneath the surface, disappeared into the cold dark below. Gone. Of her crew of 94 men, 17 were in the water. 17 survivors from a crew that had been full of life and hope and dreams just 10 minutes ago. The rest died in the submarine, killed by shells or shrapnel or drowning, trapped in compartments that flooded in seconds, burned in fires they couldn't escape, crushed when bulkheads collapsed under the weight of incoming water. 77 men, 77 sons and brothers and husbands and fathers, 77 young men who would never go home, never see their families, never live the lives they'd imagined. On Fletcher's bridge, Brennan watched the submarine disappear beneath the surface, watched the oil slick spread, watched the survivors in the water, small figures struggling against the waves. Cease fire. Rescue survivors. His voice was calm, professional, the same tone he'd used to order the attack. No triumph, no celebration, just a job done and the next task to execute. Fletcher's crew threw life rings to the Japanese sailors in the water, lowered cargo nets over the side, helped pull exhausted men aboard, men who minutes ago had been trying to kill them. Tanaka was pulled from the water by a young American sailor who looked about his age. Couldn't have been more than 20. The sailor wrapped Tanaka in a gray wool blanket that scratched against his skin but was warm. So warm. Someone else handed him hot coffee in a tin cup. Tanaka didn't speak English, but he understood kindness, understood that these men who had just killed 77 of his shipmates were now saving his life, understood that war was complicated in ways he'd never imagined. He sat on Fletcher's deck wrapped in the blanket, shaking from cold and shock and reaction. Around him, 16 other survivors were being treated by American medics, being given blankets and coffee and first aid for their injuries. An American medic, young with kind eyes, knelt next to Tanaka and examined the cut on his head where he'd hit the valve. The medic cleaned it gently and applied a bandage with practiced efficiency. "Easy, buddy. We got you. You're safe now." Tanaka didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Gentle, caring, the same tone his mother used when he'd hurt himself as a child. He looked at the American sailor who'd pulled him from the water, looked at the medic treating his wound, looked at the crew moving around the deck, securing from battle stations, going back to whatever they'd been doing before the alarm sounded. They're just kids, just like us. The thought came unbidden. These Americans weren't the demons Japanese propaganda described. They were young men doing a job, following orders, fighting a war they probably didn't understand any better than he did. In the sonar room below decks, Robert Hendricks sat at his station, staring at the screen that showed nothing now. The contact was gone. The submarine was dead. He'd tracked it through 8 massive explosions that could have damaged his equipment, could have destroyed his hearing, could have done a dozen things to make him lose contact. He hadn't lost contact. He'd done his job perfectly. Maintained track through the entire attack, given the bridge accurate bearings and ranges. Made it possible for Fletcher to position correctly for the depth charge attack. Made it possible for Torres and his gun crew to destroy the submarine. Hendricks should have felt proud, victorious, successful. Instead, he leaned over and vomited into the trash can next to his chair. 77 men. He'd tracked them to their deaths. His skill, his determination, his refusal to fail had killed 77 men who had mothers and families and lives they wanted to live. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. His hands were shaking. His ears were ringing from the depth charge explosions transmitted through the hull. His whole body felt wrong, disconnected, like he was watching himself from outside. On deck, Daniel Torres stood next to Mount 51, looking at the 17 prisoners of war sitting under guard. Looking at young men not much different from his own crew. Same age, same determination, same willingness to do their duty. His gun had fired 38 shells in 7 minutes. 38 times Chen had loaded. 38 times the gun had roared and bucked and sent death across the water. Hit rate approximately 73%. 28 hits. 28 shells punching through steel. 28 explosions inside a submarine full of men. How many had his gun killed? How many of those 77 dead had been killed by shells from Mount 51, 20, 30 more? Torres didn't know. Would never know exactly. But he knew enough. They were someone's sons, someone's brothers. Just like Raphael was mine. The thought wouldn't leave him. He looked at his hands. The hands that had directed his crew, that had called out ranges and bearings and fire commands, that had turned young men into a killing machine so efficient it scared him. These were the same hands that had held his little brother's baseball mitt before Raphael shipped out to Pearl Harbor. The same hands that had punched bag after bag in the boxing gym, trying to work out grief that had no outlet. The same hands that had written condolence letters to families of men who died before he could save them. Now they were the hands of someone who just helped kill nearly 80 men in 7 minutes. Torres walked to the small chapel, the room barely bigger than a closet with a cross bolted to the bulkhead and 3 chairs that didn't match. He knelt, clasped his hands, tried to pray. The words wouldn't come. Above decks, Commander Brennan stood on the bridge wing, watching the sun rise over an ocean that looked peaceful now. Like nothing had happened. Like 77 men hadn't just died in the most violent way imaginable. He pulled out a small notebook and began writing his after-action report. The words came easily. Clinical, professional, just facts and observations and assessments. Attack submerged submarine contact with depth charges. Submarine forced to surface. Engaged with main battery. Submarine destroyed by gunfire. 17 prisoners recovered. No damage to Fletcher. Ammunition expended 73 rounds, 5-inch .38 caliber. Assessment tactics successful. Recommend immediate dissemination to all destroyer commands. He read it over, nodded. It was accurate, complete. Everything that mattered was there. Everything except what it felt like to kill nearly 100 men in 7 minutes. Except what it cost the men who did it. Except the weight they'd carry for the rest of their lives. But that wasn't what after-action reports were for. Brennan closed the notebook, looked at the ocean, thought about his wife Sarah, who died in 1941, thought about the German U-boat crews he'd killed in the Atlantic, thought about all the death this war demanded and would continue to demand until someone finally won or everyone finally died. He didn't feel triumphant, didn't feel victorious, just felt tired, old, ready for this war to be over so he could stop killing and start forgetting. But the war wasn't over, wouldn't be over for years yet, and Fletcher had proven something important, had demonstrated tactics that would change anti-submarine warfare across the entire Pacific theater. Within 2 weeks, every destroyer commander in the Pacific Fleet would receive copies of Brennan's report, would study the tactics, would drill their crews, would prepare to do exactly what Fletcher had done. The killing had only just begun. Within 2 weeks, the killing spread across the Pacific like a virus finding vulnerable hosts. April 7th, 1943, 40 miles northwest of Guadalcanal, where the water was deep and the currents were treacherous and Japanese submarines had operated with impunity for months. USS Nicholas Fletcher class destroyer hull number D-449 detected a submarine contact at dawn. Commander William Brown was younger than Brennan, more aggressive, eager to prove that Fletcher's success wasn't luck, but replicable tactics. He'd read the after-action report 3 times, studied every detail, drilled his crew until they could execute the attack sequence in their sleep. He got his chance at 06:15 hours when his sonar operator, a farm kid from Iowa named Miller, who reminded everyone of Hendricks, called out contact bearing and range with a voice that barely shook. Brown executed the attack exactly as Brennan had described. Depth charges to force surfacing, immediate engagement with main battery, maximum rate of fire, no hesitation, no mercy. Japanese submarine I-3 surfaced damaged and unable to dive at 06:23. Nicholas opened fire at 2,000 yards. The range was longer than Fletcher's engagement, but Nicholas's gun crews had trained hard, motivated by competition with Fletcher's reputation. 3 minutes, 42 rounds fired, 31 hits, 74% accuracy. A-3 didn't just sink. She disintegrated under the impacts. The pressure hull, weakened by depth charge damage, couldn't withstand the punishment. She broke apart, sank in pieces, oil and debris and bodies spreading across the surface like evidence of an execution. 99 crew members, 0 survivors. Nicholas's crew cheered. They'd beaten Fletcher's time by 4 minutes, had achieved better accuracy, had proven they could do it too. Commander Brown filed his report with pride, with satisfaction, with the confidence of a man who'd accomplished something significant. He didn't mention that his sonar operator Miller vomited after the battle, didn't mention that his gun captain, a tough Marine named Sullivan, sat alone in the head for an hour afterward, staring at his hands, didn't mention the nightmares that would start that night and continue for weeks. Those details weren't relevant to the tactical assessment. April 24th, USS Taylor Fletcher class destroyer hull, number DD-468 on anti-submarine patrol near Tulagi. Commander Benjamin Katz was a veteran of Atlantic convoy duty, methodical and thorough, the kind of officer who followed doctrine precisely because doctrine was written in blood and experience. Sonar contact at 14:30 hours. Submarine attempting to infiltrate the harbor under a thermal layer that should have hidden it, would have hidden it from older sonar. But Taylor had the new QC equipment and an operator trained by Hendricks himself during a brief port call where knowledge was transferred like precious cargo. Depth charge attack. 4 runs, systematic, professional. No wasted charges, no panic, just steady pressure until the submarine's dive controls failed and she broached uncontrollably. I-27 broke the surface at 14:46. Taylor's guns were already tracking the projected surfacing point. Katz had studied Brennan's report, had calculated where a damaged submarine would likely surface based on the attack geometry. His guns were aimed and ready before I-27 fully cleared the water. 4 minutes from first shot to final sinking, 61 rounds fired, 47 hits, 77% accuracy. 105 crew, 8 survivors pulled from water thick with oil and debris. One of those survivors, a young petty officer named Nakamura, who spoke broken English, learned from a missionary school, told his interrogators something that would be included in intelligence reports and eventually reach the highest levels of the Imperial Japanese Navy. American destroyer guns, very fast. Very accurate. We have no chance. When submarines surface, we already dead. Just don't know yet. The interrogator, a Navy intelligence officer who spoke fluent Japanese, noted the resignation in Nakamura's voice. The acceptance. The knowledge that had come too late for 105 men, but might save others if the information was acted upon. It wouldn't be acted upon. Not in time. Not before hundreds more died. May 7th. USS Radford, Fletcher-class destroyer hull, number D446, patrolling north of Espiritu Santo on a night so dark the ocean and sky merged into undifferentiated blackness. No moon. Heavy clouds. The kind of night when Japanese submarines surfaced to recharge batteries because they believed darkness made them safe. Commander Walter Benson was on the bridge drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago when the SG radar operator called out a contact. 12,000 yards, moving slowly, on the surface. Radford had the new surface search radar that could detect a submarine's conning tower at ranges that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Technology was changing the equation. Darkness was no longer protection. The ocean had no hiding places anymore. Benson increased speed to flank. 38 knots. The destroyer cutting through black water with a bow wave that glowed with bioluminescence, leaving a trail of light in her wake like a hunting comet. Submarine I-17 detected Radford at 8,000 yards. The lookouts saw the phosphorescent wake, understood what it meant, sounded the alarm. The submarine attempted to dive. Claxons blaring, men running to stations, hatches being dogged shut. The controlled chaos of crash diving. But Radford was closing too fast. The mathematics were brutal. A submarine needed 45 seconds to dive from surface to safe depth. Radford could cover 8,000 yards in less than 4 minutes. I-17 was still on the surface, still vulnerable when Radford reached firing range. Benson opened fire at 3,000 yards. Night firing was harder. The target was harder to see, harder to track. But the fire control radar helped. The Mark 37 director could track targets in darkness and weather in conditions where human eyes failed. The first salvo illuminated the night, 5 guns firing simultaneously. The muzzle flashes turned darkness today for a fraction of a second. Long enough to see I-17 struggling to dive her stern, still visible men on the conning tower, desperately trying to get below. The shells arrived 3 seconds later. 2 hits on the first salvo. One struck the conning tower, killing everyone there instantly. The other penetrated the pressure hull aft, flooding the engine room. I-17 couldn't dive now. Couldn't escape. Could only die. 6 minutes of continuous fire. 83 rounds. 56 hits. 67% accuracy in darkness. 100 crew members, no survivors. The submarine sank so fast that men trapped inside had no time to escape. No time to open hatches or grab life preservers or do anything but realize they were going to die in a steel coffin that was filling with water. Radford's crew, secured from battle stations, went back to routine patrol, another contact, another kill, another set of numbers for the statistical reports. Commander Benson filed his after-action report and noted that night operations were now feasible with the new radar. That darkness no longer protected submarines. That the ocean had become a killing ground where technology and tactics combined to make survival nearly impossible. May 15th, USS Chevalier Fletcher-class destroyer hull, number D451, operating southwest of New Georgia. Commander Ernest Evans was the most aggressive destroyer captain in the Pacific Fleet. The kind of officer who sought out danger, who volunteered for the hardest missions, who would later earn the Medal of Honor at the Battle of Samar by attacking Japanese battleships with a destroyer and fighting until his ship was destroyed beneath him. Evans had read about the submarine kills, had studied the tactics, had drilled his crew harder than anyone. He wanted a submarine, wanted to prove that aggression and skill could achieve even better results than the methodical approaches other commanders used. Sonar contact at 0830, submarine RO-34, smaller than the fleet boats but still dangerous, still deadly if given the chance. Evans didn't give her a chance. 5 depth charge runs. Brutal, relentless, more charges per run than standard doctrine recommended. Evans was spending depth charges like ammunition was free because he wanted that submarine on the surface where his guns could reach it. RO-34's ballast tanks ruptured under the punishment. The submarine lost depth control. Broach's stern first propellers breaking the surface while the bow was still underwater. An uncontrolled surfacing that left her completely vulnerable. Chevalier's guns engaged at 1,400 yards. The range was close, almost point blank for naval gunnery. The hit rate was devastating. 2 minutes, 38 rounds fired, 29 hits, 76% accuracy. RO-34 didn't just sink, she was crushed. The pressure hull collapsed under multiple impacts. She broke apart, above water, sank in pieces, left a debris field half a mile wide. 38 crew members, 4 survivors, pulled from water, all injured, all in shock. Evans stood on the bridge watching the survivors being recovered and felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd wanted this, had sought it out, had pushed his crew to be more aggressive, more efficient, more deadly. They'd succeeded. They had killed 34 men in 2 minutes, had set a new record for speed and efficiency, had proven that maximum aggression produced maximum results. But standing there watching young Japanese sailors being pulled from the water, watching medics treat their injuries, watching them wrapped in blankets and given coffee, Evans felt something he hadn't expected. Doubt. Not about the tactics, not about the mission, not about the necessity of killing enemy submarines before they could kill American ships, but about the cost. About what it did to men to become that efficient at killing. About whether you could turn young sailors into a perfectly functioning death machine and expect them to turn it off when the war ended. He didn't include those thoughts in his after-action report. By June 1943, Japanese submarine losses in the Solomon Islands and Southwest Pacific had reached levels that could only be described as catastrophic. The numbers told a story that couldn't be ignored, couldn't be explained away, couldn't be dismissed as bad luck or poor seamanship. 23 fleet submarines deployed to the area since January. 11 sunk, nearly 50% losses in 5 months. Of those 11, 7 were confirmed kills by Fletcher-class destroyers using the depth charge and gunfire tactics that had started with Brennan's attack on I-2. 7 submarines, over 700 submariners dead, an average kill time of 4 minutes from surfacing to sinking, an average survival rate of less than 10%. The mathematics were unsustainable. If losses continued at this rate, the entire submarine fleet would be destroyed within a year. Every boat, every crew, every experienced commander who knew the waters and the tactics and the 1,000 small skills that kept submarines alive. In Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy's 6th Fleet headquarters, which commanded all submarine operations, convened an emergency meeting. Senior officers gathered in a room that smelled like cigarette smoke and desperation to discuss a problem that had no good solutions. The classified report they reviewed, captured after the war from a filing cabinet in a basement archive, revealed how completely the tactical equation had shifted, how thoroughly the Americans had reversed the advantage. American destroyers have developed coordinated tactics combining depth charges with surface gunfire that our submarines cannot counter. Once forced to surface by depth charge damage, our submarines are destroyed within minutes by accurate and overwhelming 5-inch gunfire. American destroyers achieve hit rates exceeding 60% at ranges from 1,000 to 3,000 meters. Our submarines' deck guns are ineffective against destroyers at these ranges. Our submarines cannot dive quickly enough to escape once damaged. Combine these factors mean our submarines operating in contested waters face near certain detection and destruction. The report continued with recommendations that were really admissions of defeat dressed up in military language. Recommend immediate withdrawal of all offensive submarine operations from American-controlled waters. Recommend reassignment of submarine assets to defensive patrol lines and supply missions where American destroyer presence is minimal. Recommend suspension of aggressive anti-shipping operations until effective countermeasures can be developed. Translation run. Hide. Stop fighting because fighting means dying. The psychological impact on Japanese submarine crews was profound and immediate. Men who had started the war believing they were elite warriors, invisible predators, unstoppable forces, now understood they were prey. Hunted, marked for death. Petty Officer Haruki Nakagawa, torpedo officer aboard submarine Warren 24, wrote a letter to his wife that was never sent, found decades later in his personal effects after his death from natural causes in 1987. We no longer hunt American warships. We are the hunted. Their destroyers find us with their sonar no matter how deep we dive. They attack with depth charges that explode deeper than we thought possible. If we are damaged and forced to surface, their guns destroy us before we can man our deck gun. I have watched 2 submarines in our squadron die this way. The Americans give no quarter. They fire until the submarine sinks, until every man aboard is dead or in the water. This is not warfare as we were taught. This is execution. This is being hunted to extinction. 3 weeks after writing that letter, I-24 was patrolling near Tulagi when an American destroyer detected her on sonar. The submarine dove deep, evaded successfully, survived the encounter. But the experience left the crew shaken. Left Nakagawa writing in his journal about the sound of depth charges, about the terror of knowing that if they were forced to surface, they would die. I-24 survived the war. One of the few, Nakagawa survived with her, lived to be 82 years old. Never spoke about the war until the 1980s when an interviewer convinced him to share his story. Every night I hear the depth charges. Every night I wonder why I lived when so many died, why I was lucky when luck was so rare. I carry their names, the crews of the submarines I knew. The men I trained with, served with, called friends. Over 1,000 names, I carry them all. The tactical response from the Japanese submarine force was swift, but ultimately futile. New orders went out to all boats. Avoid contested areas. Operate at maximum depth whenever American destroyers were detected. Minimize time on the surface. Abort missions if American anti-submarine forces were too strong. But these defensive measures simply meant Japanese submarines stopped being effective. A submarine avoiding American destroyers couldn't attack American warships. A submarine operating at maximum depth had limited maneuverability, limited battery endurance, limited ability to conduct its mission. A submarine authorized to abort if threatened was a submarine that accomplished nothing. The offensive submarine doctrine that Japan had developed in the 1930s, that had been refined through years of training and exercise, that had seemed so promising in December 1941, collapsed under the weight of American technological and tactical superiority. By summer 1943, Japanese submarines were being withdrawn from offensive operations and reassigned to missions that had never been their purpose. Supply runs to bypassed garrisons, transportation of essential materials, evacuation of key personnel, the kind of work that cargo ships should do that submarines only did when the sea lanes were too dangerous for surface vessels. It was an admission of defeat in everything but name. June 22, 1943. Commander Takeshi Yamada, who had written so confidently in January about American destroyers being blind children in the dark, received orders for I-26's final patrol. The orders were clinical, professional, devoid of any acknowledgement that they were essentially a death sentence. Patrol waters near Espiritu Santo. Conduct reconnaissance of American naval movements. Avoid contact unless targets of opportunity present themselves. Return by July 5th. Yamada read the orders 3 times, read between the lines. Understood what wasn't being said. Espiritu Santo was where I-2 had died, where I-3 had died, where I-17 had died. The waters were thick with American destroyers hunting submarines. The area was a graveyard, and they were sending him there. The night before departure, Yamada wrote 2 letters in his small cabin aboard I-26 while the submarine rocked gently at the dock in Truk. The first letter was to his wife Akiko and his daughter Emiko, born 3 weeks earlier, while he'd been at sea. He'd never met her, had only seen a photograph that Akiko had sent. A tiny baby with eyes that couldn't focus yet wrapped in blankets, innocent and perfect. My dearest Akiko and little Emiko, if you are reading this, I have joined the ancestors. I write this knowing I may not return from the patrol ahead. The waters we must enter are dangerous beyond what I can express in a letter that may be read by censors. Akiko, you were the light of my life, the anchor that kept me steady. I am sorry I could not give you more years, more memories, more of the future we plan. Emiko, my daughter, I will never grow strong. Be proud. Remember that your father served with honor, even when honor meant accepting death. Tell her about me, Akiko. Tell her I loved her before I knew her. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her that her name means beautiful blessing and that she was my last beautiful thought in this life. The second letter he sealed in a waterproof case and kept in his jacket pocket. It was addressed to the American captain who would kill him. He wrote it in Japanese, knowing it might never be translated, might never be read, but needing to write it anyway. To the American commander who ends my life. You are doing your duty as I did mine. We are both warriors caught in a war neither of us chose. When you sink my submarine, know that my crew and I fought honorably. We served our nation with pride. We followed orders we knew might be our last. I do not ask for mercy. I ask only that you remember we were men like you, that we had families who loved us, that we did not want this war but fought it because our country asked us to. If you survive this war, if you return home to whatever future awaits you, remember the men you killed were human, were worthy opponents, were doing exactly what you would do in their place. I have a daughter I will never meet. Her name is Amiko. Beautiful blessing. If you have children, hold them close. Tell them their father was brave. I hope my daughter will be told the same. Yamada sealed the letter, put it in his jacket, went up on deck and looked at the stars, trying to memorize the sky, trying to hold on to something beautiful before entering water, where beauty didn't exist. I-26 departed truck at dawn. 94 crew members. All of them knew the odds. All of them understood that American destroyers had developed tactics that Japanese submarines couldn't counter. All of them went anyway because duty demanded it and honor required it, and refusing would accomplish nothing except disgrace. For 3 days, A-26 patrolled near Espiritu Santo. For 3 days, they detected American destroyers on sonar and dove deep and evaded and survived. For 3 days, Yamada allowed himself to hope that maybe they'd be the exception, the ones who made it through the crew that beat the odds. On the 4th day, the batteries were at 18%, critical level. They had to surface to recharge or the submarine would be unable to maneuver, unable to escape, unable to do anything but drift helplessly until the batteries died completely and the air grew foul and the crew suffocated. Yamada made the only decision he could, the decision every submarine commander facing this situation had to make. Surface, maximum speed. We charge the batteries and run. June 22nd, 0300 hours. I-26 surfaced 6,000 yards from USM Bannon Fletcher-class destroyer on routine patrol. Commander Donald McDonald was on O'Bannon's bridge drinking coffee when the radar operator called out the contact. Surface submarine, bearing 045, range 6,000 yards. McDonald had killed submarines before, had read all the after-action reports, had drilled his crew until they could execute the attack sequence perfectly. He set down his coffee cup and gave orders in a voice that was calm, almost bored the voice of a man doing routine work. All ahead flank, gun crews to battle stations. This is what we train for, gentlemen. On I-26, Yamada saw O'Bannon on the horizon, saw the bow wave growing as the destroyer accelerated, understood immediately what was happening. He had perhaps 45 seconds to dive before the destroyer reached firing range. 45 seconds to get the crew below close. The hatches get the submarine underwater where she might survive. Prepare to dive close. All hatches quickly, men ran. The organized chaos of crash diving. But crash diving took time they didn't have. O'Bannon opened fire at 4,000 yards. Extreme range. The first salvo missed shells, falling short, throwing up geysers of water that looked ghostly in the pre-dawn darkness. But missing didn't matter. The shells forced Yamada to keep men on deck, keep hatches open, keep the submarine on the surface. He couldn't dive with hatches open, couldn't close hatches while men were topside. The destroyer had trapped him with the threat of gunfire alone. O'Bannon closed the range. 3,000 yards, 2,000 yards. The gun crews tracking the submarine with mechanical precision. The fire control computers calculating solutions faster than human minds could follow. At 2,000 yards with I-26 still on the surface, still vulnerable, still trying desperately to dive, O'Bannon's second salvo found its target. The first shell hit the conning tower, where Yamada stood giving orders, trying to save his crew, trying to do his duty to the end. The explosion was massive. The conning tower essentially disintegrated. Everyone inside died instantly. No pain, no awareness, just existence ending between one heartbeat and the next. Yamada's last thought in the microsecond before the shell ended, Everything was of a baby girl he'd never met, a face he'd only seen in a photograph, a daughter who would grow up without knowing her father except through stories. Emiko. The waterproof case with his letters flew through the air as the conning tower exploded, landed in the water, floated, would eventually be recovered by O'Bannon's crew and sent to intelligence and translated and filed away in an archive where it would remain classified until 1993. 50 years later, when the letters were declassified, they would be sent to Japan. A researcher would find Miko Yamada, now an elderly woman, a retired teacher, a grandmother. She would read her father's words for the first time, would learn that he'd thought of her in his final moments, would cry for a father she'd never known, but who had loved her. O'Bannon's guns continued firing. 4 minutes of continuous fire. 56 rounds, 41 hits, 73% accuracy. I-26 didn't sink gracefully. She was beaten to pieces. The pressure hull ruptured in multiple locations. The internal explosions started fires and flooding that made damage control impossible. She rolled to port capsized and sank in water too deep for any hope of salvage or recovery. 94 crew members, 0 survivors. McDonald watched the submarine disappear and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph, no regret. Just professional acknowledgement that a mission had been accomplished, a threat had been eliminated, another submarine had joined the dozens of others on the bottom of the Pacific. He filed his after-action report. Target destroyed, no damage to O'Bannon. Another good day. For McDonald, it was routine. For the families of 94 Japanese submariners, it was the end of the world. August 28, 1943. Daniel Torres had transferred to USS Taylor for a special mission. Taylor's captain wanted the best gun crew available for an operation near Santa Isabel Island, where intelligence reported heavy submarine activity. He requested Torres specifically. Torres brought his philosophy with him. Aggressive, relentless, perfect. Sonar contact at 0915 hours. Submarine WWII-27. One of the larger fleet boats trying to infiltrate the harbor approaches. Taylor's sonar operator, trained in Hendricks methods, maintained contact through 4 depth charge runs. I-27 suffered catastrophic damage to her dive planes. When she broached at 1,400 yards, Torres was ready. This was different from the others. Torres had participated in 8 kills, had helped develop the tactics, had trained crews across the fleet. He knew exactly what would happen, knew the mathematics, knew the outcome before the first shell left the barrel. That knowledge made it worse. Load armor piercing, range 1,400, target center mass, fire when ready. His voice was mechanical, empty. The voice of someone who'd done this so many times it had stopped being combat and become industrial process. Manufacturing death with the efficiency of an assembly line. Chen loaded, Sullivan pointed, Morrison trained, Williams set fuses. The crew moved like clockwork, like machines, like men who'd forgotten they were killing human beings. The engagement lasted 2 minutes and 15 seconds. 34 rounds fired, 31 hits, 91% accuracy. A new record. I-27 didn't just sink, she broke apart. The pressure hull, weakened by depth charges and then shattered by shell impacts, couldn't hold integrity. She came apart above water, sank in multiple pieces, left wreckage scattered across a square mile of ocean. 105 crew members, 8 survivors. Taylor pulled the survivors from the water, gave them blankets and coffee and medical treatment. Standard procedure, humanitarian obligation. One of the survivors, a young petty officer who looked barely 20, sat on deck wrapped in a blanket, staring at nothing. A medic was treating a burn on his arm. The young man's eyes were vacant. Shock. Trauma. The look of someone who'd seen things that broke the mind. Torres walked past. The young man looked up, made eye contact, spoke in broken English. "You?" Gun Captain Torres stopped, nodded slowly. "Yeah, I'm the gun captain." The young man's face didn't change. No anger, no hate, just acknowledgement. "You very good." "Very fast. My brother was loader, like your man. He died today. You very fast. He no have chance." The words hit Torres like a physical blow. This kid's brother had been a loader, had been doing the same job Chen was doing, had been loading shells on I-27, trying to fight back, trying to survive, trying to do his duty. And Chen had been faster. Torres's crew had been faster. That speed, that efficiency, that perfection had killed this kid's brother along with 96 other men. Torres looked at Chen standing by Mount 51. Chen was cleaning the gun, his movements automatic, his face blank. The 18-year-old kid who'd barely been able to lift a shell 6 months ago was now the most efficient killer in the Pacific Fleet. And Torres had made him that way. Torres walked away from the prestige survivor without saying anything else. Walked to the rail, looked at the ocean where pieces of I-27 were still floating. Oil slicks, debris, evidence of slaughter. His hands were shaking. The hands that had directed perfect fire, that had called out ranges and bearings with mechanical precision. That had helped kill over 400 men in 5 months. That night, Torres went to Taylor's small chapel, knelt in front of the cross, tried to pray. But this time, instead of asking for strength to continue, he asked for something else. God, I've become very good at killing. Too good. I can do it without thinking now, without feeling. That scares me more than combat ever did. Because if I can turn this off, turn into a machine that kills efficiently without caring, what does that make me? What will I be when this war ends? Will I be able to turn it back on? Will I remember how to be human? Or will I just be a gun captain who's forgotten there were people on the other end of those shells? The prayer didn't make him feel better, didn't provide answers, didn't change anything. But it was the first time Torres had acknowledged what he was becoming. The first crack in the armor he'd built around himself. It would take 40 more years before that crack became a breakthrough. For Torres found redemption in coaching kids and teaching them that strength didn't require violence in becoming gentle because he'd been so efficient at being deadly. But that night, kneeling in a chapel on a destroyer in the middle of the Pacific, Daniel Torres began the long journey back to being human. On Fletcher, 3,000 miles away in Pearl Harbor, for refit and replenishment, Robert Hendricks sat in the sonar room at 0200 hours unable to sleep. He'd been promoted to sonar supervisor, had trained dozens of operators, had been offered a transfer stateside to the sonar school as an instructor. He'd declined, not because he loved the work, not because he was eager to track more submarines, but because leaving felt like abandoning the men he'd served with, felt like running from responsibility, felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. Hendricks had tracked 12 submarines to their deaths. His contact retention rate was 97%, best in the fleet. He'd received commendations that praised his dedication, his skill, his unwavering focus under pressure. He'd accepted the commendations with a numb smile and filed them away in his locker where he wouldn't have to look at them. I'm good at this. Men die because I'm good at this. That's all there is. He'd stopped vomiting after kills, stopped shaking, stopped feeling much of anything. The farm boy from Nebraska who'd wanted to be an accountant had become a machine for tracking submarines. Efficient, reliable, unfeeling. Or at least that's what he told himself. That's what he needed to believe to keep functioning. That he'd shut off the part of himself that cared, that felt, that acknowledged the humanity of the men he was helping to kill. But late at night alone in the sonar room, while other men slept, Hendricks would put on his headphones and listen to the recordings of past contacts. Would listen to the moment when a submarine tried to evade, when it changed course and speed and depth trying to escape. Would imagine the sonar operator on the other end, a young man like himself, listening to American active sonar and knowing what it meant. Would wonder if that operator had a family waiting for him, had dreams beyond the war, had reasons to live that were just as valid as Hendricks' own. The thoughts didn't change anything, wouldn't stop him from tracking the next submarine with the same efficiency he'd tracked the last 12. But they kept him human, kept him connected to the reality that his skill had consequences beyond tactical victories and commendations. Hendricks pulled out his notebook, the same one he'd written in back in January when he'd promised himself he wouldn't fail again. He turned to a blank page and wrote, 12 submarines, maybe 900 men. I don't know their names, don't know their faces, but I know they were human, had mothers, had dreams, had lives they wanted to live. I did my duty. I'm not sorry I did my duty, but I'm not proud either. I just am. I exist with what I did, with what I was part of, with the knowledge that my skill mattered and mattering had a cost. He closed the notebook, put it back in his pocket, went back to his bunk. Tomorrow there would be another patrol, another submarine, another contact to track, and Robert Hendricks would do his job with the same efficiency that had killed 900 men, because that's what the war demanded. And the war didn't care about the quantities. By September 1943, Japanese submarine operations in contested waters had effectively ceased. The Imperial Navy's Sixth Fleet could no longer justify sending submarines into areas patrolled by American destroyers. The mathematics were too brutal. The survival rate too low. The strategic value too minimal compared to the cost. Send 10 submarines on patrol, lose 3 or 4 to Fletcher-class destroyers, accomplish minimal damage to American forces. The equation didn't balance, would never balance. The only rational response was withdrawal. Submarines that should have been hunting American aircraft carriers were reassigned to supply runs, running food and ammunition and medical supplies to bypass garrisons on islands that were cut off from conventional resupply. Dangerous work, but not suicidal. Necessary, but not glorious. The offensive submarine doctrine that Japan had perfected in the 1930s collapsed under the weight of American innovation. The aggressive fleet submarines that had attacked Pearl Harbor, Sydney Harbor, Colombo, were now reduced to cargo haulers operating in backwater areas where American destroyers rarely patrolled. It was a complete strategic failure, a technological and tactical defeat that rippled through the entire Japanese war effort. Submarines that should have been interdicting American supply lines instead ferried supplies. Submarines that should have been scouting for the fleet instead avoided areas where the fleet operated. Submarines that should have been a major strategic asset became a minor supporting element, barely worth the resources devoted to them. The Americans had won the underwater war. Decisively, overwhelmingly, with tactics that cost relatively little and produced extraordinary results. But victory came with a price that medals couldn't measure and after-action reports couldn't capture. The war ended in August 1945. Atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered unconditionally. The killing stopped, but the weight remained. Daniel Torres returned to Puerto Rico in October 1945, came home to a hero's welcome. Parades, medals, people who wanted to hear war stories. People who thought killing hundreds of men was glorious. Torres tried to tell them it wasn't glorious, tried to explain what it cost, but they didn't want to hear that. They wanted heroes, not haunted men. He tried to resume boxing, entered 3 amateur bouts in 1946, lost all 3. Not because he lacked skill, but because every time he threw a punch, he saw faces, Japanese faces, young faces, dead faces. He quit boxing after the 3rd loss, started drinking instead. By 1947, he was working construction, drinking heavily, sleeping badly. The nightmares were constant. The faces wouldn't leave. Every night he saw the submarine breaking apart, saw men jumping into the water, saw the young Japanese survivor asking about his brother. By 1948, he'd lost 2 jobs. His family was worried. His priest tried to help. Nothing worked. In 1950, Torres sat in his apartment with a bottle of pills, sleeping pills, enough to stop the nightmares permanently, enough to make the faces go away. He was about to take them when his younger sister Rosa knocked on the door. She'd been worried, hadn't heard from him in days. She used her spare key. She found him sitting on the floor with the pills in his hand. Rosa saved his life that night, got him to a hospital, got him into treatment, refused to give up on him even when he'd given up on himself. Recovery was slow, painful, required acknowledging what he'd done, what it had cost, what he'd become, required accepting that you couldn't turn young men into efficient killers and expect them to be whole afterward. But slowly with help, Torres found a way forward. In 1952, he started volunteering at a community center in San Juan, helping kids, teaching them to box, teaching them discipline and control and respect. He discovered something surprising. He was good at it, good at seeing potential in kids nobody else believed in, good at teaching them that strength without restraint was dangerous. That being good at violence didn't make violence good. By 1955, he was running the boxing program full-time, training dozens of kids, helping them avoid the streets, avoid gangs, avoid the violence that had consumed so much of his generation. Torres coached for 40 years, trained hundreds of kids, helped dozens get scholarships, helped more stay out of trouble. became known as the toughest, gentlest coach in Puerto Rico. A man who demanded excellence but never forgot his students were human beings, not machines. He died in 1989 at age 70. Over 200 former students came to his funeral. They called him the best teacher they'd ever had, said he'd saved their lives, said he was a hero. His grandson found a journal in Torres effects. The last entry, written 3 days before he died, revealed what he'd carried for 46 years. I killed more men than I can count. I was good at it, too good. The efficiency scared me then, scares me now. But I spent 40 years teaching boys to be strong without being violent, to be tough without being cruel, to understand that violence is sometimes necessary but always has a cost. Maybe that balances the scales, maybe it doesn't. But I tried. God knows I tried. I hope the men I killed, if they're watching from wherever the dead go, I hope they see what I did with the rest of my life. I hope they know I never forgot them. I hope they forgive me. I hope I can forgive myself. Robert Hendricks retired from the Navy in 1960 at age 39. He'd served 18 years, had tracked submarines through Korea, had trained hundreds of sonar operators, had become one of the most decorated sonar technicians in naval history. He returned to Nebraska, bought his family's farm from his aging parents, spent his days working the land listening to silence instead of sonar, growing things, instead of tracking things to their death. He never married, never had children, lived alone in the farmhouse where he'd grown up, maintaining the property with the same meticulous attention he'd once devoted to tracking submarines. Neighbors said he was kind but distant, would help anyone who needed it but never let anyone close, would attend church every Sunday and sit in the back and leave before anyone could engage him in conversation. He died in 2004 at age 83, heart attack while working in his barn, alone, the way he'd lived for 44 years. His executor found boxes of Navy memorabilia in the attic, commendations, citations, photographs, a carefully maintained log of every submarine he'd tracked, 12 entries, 12 dates, 12 sets of coordinates where men had died because he'd been good at his job. At the bottom of the last box was a letter addressed to no one, written in 1963, but never sent, never finished. I tracked submarines during the war. I was very good at it. 97% contact retention rate, best in the fleet. Men died because I didn't lose contact. 900 men, maybe more. I don't know their names, don't know their faces. But I know they were human, had mothers, had dreams, had lives they wanted to live. I did my duty. I'm not sorry I did my duty, but I'm not proud either. I just am. I exist with what I did, with what I was part of, with the knowledge that my skill mattered and mattering had a cost. If I could go back, would I do it differently? I don't know. I honestly don't know. Maybe that makes me a coward. Maybe that makes me honest. Maybe both. I tracked them through depth charge explosions that should have made it impossible, through evasive maneuvers, through everything they tried. I never lost contact, never failed. And 900 men died because I succeeded. That's my legacy, not the commendations, not the promotions, the 900 names I'll never know, the faces I'll never see, the lives I helped end. I carry them all. The letter ended there, unfinished. As if Hendricks had realized there was nothing more to say. No conclusion that would make sense of it. No wisdom that would resolve the contradiction of being good at something terrible. Jimmy Chen returned to San Francisco after the war in November 1945, worked in his parents' laundry for 40 years, took over the business when they retired, married a quiet woman named Mary who asked him once about the war and never asked again when she saw how the question hurt him. They had 3 children. Chen was a good father, patient, kind, present, but distant in ways his children couldn't understand. There was a part of him they couldn't reach, a place inside that was dark and locked and forbidden. His children learned not to ask about the war, learned that Daddy didn't talk about what he'd done, learned that the medals in the box in the closet were not sources of pride, but sources of pain. Chen died in 1998 at age 73 from complications of pneumonia. His children found letters he'd written but never sent, letters to the families of Japanese submariners, letters apologizing for loading the shells that had killed their sons and brothers and fathers, Letters asking for forgiveness he knew he'd never receive. The letters were in English. None of them had addresses. They were never meant to be sent. Were just Chen's way of acknowledging what he'd done, of accepting responsibility, of refusing to hide from the truth. One letter read, "I was the fastest loader in the Pacific Fleet, 19 rounds per minute. I was proud of that. Proud of my speed, my efficiency, my perfection. I helped kill hundreds of men. I don't know how many exactly. The shells I loaded were fired by someone else, hit targets. Someone else aimed at killed men I never saw. But I know I was part of it. Know my speed mattered. Know that every second I saved was a second less for submarines to die, for men to escape, for lives to be saved." I was 18 years old. 18. I just wanted to do my job well. Wanted to make my gun captain proud. Wanted to prove I was good enough. I succeeded. God help me, I succeeded, and the cost was hundreds of lives. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't matter. Know that sorry doesn't bring anyone back. But I need to say it, need to acknowledge what I was part of, need to accept that I can't hide from it, even though hiding is all I want to do. Chen's daughter, a history professor, published the letters in 2003 as part of an academic paper on the psychological cost of naval combat. She wrote that her father had been the kindest, gentlest man she'd ever known, that he'd never raised his voice, never shown anger, never hurt anyone, that the man who'd loaded shells with perfect efficiency at age 18 had spent the rest of his life trying to be gentle enough to balance the scales. Commander William Brennan continued in the Navy after the war, commanded destroyers in Korea, rose to the rank of captain, was respected, decorated, successful by every measure the Navy valued. But the man who'd pioneered the tactics that killed 1,500 Japanese submariners carried his own weight. He never remarried after Sarah died, never formed close relationships, lived for the Navy because the Navy was all he had left. In 1952, at age 44, Brennan died of a heart attack in his quarters aboard the destroyer he commanded. The official cause was cardiac failure. But those who knew him understood it was something else. It was the weight of 1,500 names, 1,500 men he'd killed not in the heat of battle, but through cold calculation, through tactical innovation that turned killing into science. His funeral was attended by dozens of officers he'd trained, men who'd used his tactics, men who'd killed efficiently because he'd shown them how. Not one of them mentioned the cost. But in Brennan's personal effects, his family found a photograph. Sarah on their wedding day. On the back, in Brennan's handwriting, a single sentence: "I did it all for you. I hope it was worth it." Whether it meant the war, the killing, the tactics, the thousands of deaths, no one knew. Brennan had taken that answer with him. In 1963, 20 years after the war, an unlikely meeting took place at the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, a memorial dedicated to Japan's war dead. A place where names were inscribed and families came to remember, and grief was permitted. Robert Hendricks was visiting Japan as part of a Veterans Reconciliation Program, an attempt to heal old wounds, to build bridges between former enemies, to demonstrate that men who'd fought each other could coexist in peace. He didn't want to be there, didn't want to face Japanese veterans who might ask what he'd done during the war, didn't want to explain that he'd tracked submarines, that his skill had mattered, that men had died because of him. But his church had organized the trip. His pastor had convinced him it might help, might provide closure, might allow him to let go of some of the weight he'd carried for 2 decades. At the memorial, looking at names inscribed in kanji he couldn't read, Hendricks noticed a man standing alone near the submarine section. A man about his age, thin, wearing a simple suit, hands clasped in front of him, staring at names with an intensity that Hendricks recognized. The man turned, their eyes met, and both recognized something in the other that transcended language and culture and nationality. The recognition of shared trauma, shared loss, shared weight. The man approached, spoke in halting English. "You, American Navy." Hendricks nodded, unable to speak. Japanese Navy. Submarine. I too. Hendricks' world stopped. I too. The first one? The one he'd tracked through 8 depth-charge explosions. The one where Fletcher had proven the tactics worked. The one where 77 men had died. The first kill. The one that started everything. Sonar man. Fletcher. I tracked your submarine. The words came out barely above a whisper. An admission, a confession. The Japanese veteran Yoshiro Tanaka, now 64 years old, was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke with a voice that carried no anger, no accusation, just acknowledgement. You very good. You no lose contact. I remember. Depth charges everywhere. Ship shaking. We think we escape. But you hold contact. Very good sonar, man. Hendricks felt tears forming. 20 years of holding it in, and here in front of a memorial to the dead, talking to a man he'd tried to kill the dam, was breaking. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I tracked you. I helped kill your friends. 77 men. Tanaka's expression didn't change. He looked at Hendricks with eyes that had seen too much survived, too much carried too much. You do duty. I do duty. You save me also. What Tanaka gestured to the memorial to the names inscribed there. Fletcher, pull me from water. Give blanket. Give coffee. American doctor, fix my head. I alive because you. Also alive because you kill my friends. Both true. War like that. Make no sense, but both true. They stood in silence. Two men connected by violence neither had chosen. Two survivors carrying the weight of those who hadn't survived. Tanaka bowed. Deep. Formal. The bow of profound respect. You do duty. I do duty. We both alive. 77 friends not alive. We remember. We carry them. That is our duty now. Not kill anymore. Just remember. Just carry. Just tell stories so they not forgotten. Hendricks bowed in return, tears running down his face for the first time in 20 years. Tears for the men who'd died, for the weight he'd carried, for the grace of being acknowledged by someone who had every right to hate him. Do you remember them? The 77. Tanaka nodded slowly. Every name, every face, I say them every year. March 14th, so they not forgotten. He pulled out a small notebook, opened it, showed Hendricks pages covered in Japanese characters, 77 names written in careful handwriting. This Ito, he teach me electrical. This Sato, he sonar man like you. This Watanabe, he's 17. Lie about age to join Navy, like American boy maybe. Hendricks looked at the names, couldn't read them, but understood what they represented. Lives, people, men who'd had mothers and dreams and futures that ended because he'd been good at his job. Can you teach me to say their names so I can remember too? Tanaka looked surprised. Then something in his expression softened. You want carry them too? I've been carrying them for 20 years. I just didn't know their names. For the next hour in the shadow of a memorial to the dead, Yoshiro Tanaka taught Robert Hendricks to pronounce 77 Japanese names. Taught him the syllables, the tones, the sounds. Taught him how to remember the men he'd killed, not as abstract numbers, but as human beings with names and identities. When they finished, Tanaka wrote out the names in Romanized letters in Hendricks' notebook. Hendricks would carry that notebook for the rest of his life. Would practice the names every March 14th, the anniversary of I-2's sinking. Would say them aloud in his farmhouse in Nebraska where no one could hear. Would honor the dead the only way he knew how, by refusing to forget, by carrying the weight not as penance but as responsibility. Before they parted, Tanaka and Hendricks exchanged addresses. Promised to write. Didn't promise to be friends because some wounds don't heal that way, but promised to remember together, to carry the weight together, to be witnesses to what war cost. They kept that promise. Wrote letters twice a year for the next 40 years. Never met again in person, but maintained a connection that transcended former enmity. When Tanaka died in 2006 at age 82, his family sent Hendricks the notebook with the 77 names, told him Tanaka had requested it, had wanted Hendricks to have it, had said that the American sonar man understood what it meant to carry the dead. Hendricks died 2 years before Tanaka in 2004. But before he died, he'd copied the 77 names into his will. Requested they be inscribed on his tombstone along with a single sentence. He carried them all. The 5-inch gun that the Japanese had dismissed as useless against submarines served on American destroyers for 40 years after the war. Served in Korea, Vietnam, countless smaller conflicts. The tactic of forcing submarines to surface and destroying them with gunfire became standard doctrine taught in naval academies, studied by officers refined and improved. Modern navies still mount rapid-fire guns specifically for engaging surface submarines. The technology has changed, but the principle remains. Speed matters. Accuracy matters. Overwhelming firepower applied quickly produces results. The lesson was learned: never underestimate innovation. Never assume that weapons can't be used in ways their designers didn't intend. Never believe that tactical superiority is permanent. But there's another lesson that after-action reports don't capture, that tactical manuals don't teach, that the official histories rarely acknowledge. Victory has a quan. Efficiency in killing is still killing. The men who execute tactics perfectly carry the weight of that perfection forever. 1,500 Japanese submariners died in 6 months because their leaders underestimated a weapon, because they believed American destroyers couldn't adapt, because they thought the 5-inch gun was irrelevant to submarine warfare. They were wrong, but those 1,500 men weren't monsters, weren't demons, weren't evil. They were sailors doing their duty, sons and brothers and fathers and husbands. Men with dreams and fears and families who loved them, just like the American destroyer crews who killed them. War demanded they become enemies, demanded they try to kill each other, demanded that efficiency in killing be praised and rewarded and refined. History records who won, but humanity demands we remember that all of them paid the price. The ocean keeps their secrets. The depths hold their bodies. The official records document their deaths with coordinates and dates in dispassionate language. But the survivors, the men who tracked and aimed and fired and killed, they carry the names, carry the faces they never saw or saw only briefly in water covered with oil, carry the knowledge that their skill mattered and mattering had consequences. Daniel Torres coaching kids in San Juan, teaching them strength without violence, dying surrounded by 200 former students who called him the gentlest man they'd ever known. Robert Hendricks alone on a Nebraska farm, finding peace in silence and solitude, saying 77 Japanese names every March 14th so they wouldn't be forgotten. Jimmy Chen running a laundry in San Francisco, being gentle because he'd been efficient at violence, writing letters apologizing to families he'd never meet for deaths he'd helped cause. Yoshiro Tanaka in Hokkaido, whispering 77 names every year, building a quiet life, marrying, having children, teaching a former enemy to remember the dead with respect. These are the real legacies, not the tactical innovations, not the victory in the underwater war, not the statistics and the kill ratios and the efficiency ratings, but the men who survived, who carried the weight, who tried to be better than what war had made them, who refused to forget that the enemies they'd killed had been human. In 2008, on the 65th anniversary of I-2's sinking, a small ceremony was held at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. The families of Hendricks, Torres, and Chen had been invited. So had the family of Yoshiro Tanaka, who'd passed away 2 years earlier. Tanaka's granddaughter, Yuki, attended. She was a teacher like her grandfather had dreamed of being. She brought the notebook with the 77 names. The same notebook Tanaka had kept for 65 years. The same names he'd taught Hendricks to pronounce. Torres's grandson, Miguel, was there, a social worker who'd been inspired by his grandfather's work with at-risk youth. Chen's daughter, Sarah, was there, the history professor who'd published her father's letters. Hendricks had no children, but his church sent a representative carrying the notebook where Hendricks had written the 77 names in Romanized Japanese. They stood together at a memorial dedicated not to victory, but to remembrance, to all who'd served, to all who'd died, to all who'd carried the weight of what war demanded. A Navy chaplain spoke, talked about duty and sacrifice and honor, the usual words. But then Yuki Tanaka stood up. She'd asked to speak. The ceremony organizers had agreed, though they weren't sure what she'd say. My grandfather survived I-2. He was one of 17 men pulled from the water by USS Fletcher on March 14, 1943. 77 of his friends died that day. He carried their names for 63 years. Every March 14th, he would go to the ocean and say their names, all 77, so they would not be forgotten. Before he died, my grandfather told me something. He said the American sonar man who tracked his submarine had learned to say those names too, had carried them as well, had remembered them not as enemies, but as human beings. She held up both notebooks, Tanaka's original and Hendricks' copy. These men, American and Japanese, understood something important. They understood that war makes us do terrible things, makes us kill people we don't hate, makes us become efficient at causing death. But they also understood that we have a choice about what we do after, about whether we carry the weight with honor or try to pretend it doesn't exist. My grandfather chose to carry it with honor, to remember, to teach me about the cost of war, not through hatred, but through remembrance. The American men who killed 77 Japanese sailors that day, they chose to carry it too. They became teachers, coaches, quiet men who lived gentle lives because they'd seen too much violence. She paused, looked at Miguel Torres and Sarah Chen. Your grandfathers and father helped kill my grandfather's friends. That is true and cannot be changed. But they also saved my grandfather's life, pulled him from the water, gave him a future, gave him the chance to marry, to have children, to teach me these stories. Both things are true. War makes truth complicated. She placed both notebooks on the memorial. I give these to the Naval Academy Library, so future officers can see these names, can understand that every submarine sunk, every ship destroyed, every battle won, there are names, people, families who grieve. Maybe if we remember that, we will choose peace more often, fight less, kill less, carry less weight. The ceremony ended in silence. No one knew what to say. The chaplain's prepared words about glory and victory felt hollow after Yuki's speech, but Miguel Torres approached her afterward, shook her hand. Thank you for honoring them, all of them. Yuki nodded. Your grandfather taught boys to be strong without being violent. My grandfather taught me to remember without hatred. Maybe that's how we honor all of them, by being better than war made them. That's what we should remember. That's the story that matters. Not the tactics or the technology or the victory, but the men who survived and spent the rest of their lives trying to be worthy of that survival, trying to balance the scales, trying to carry the dead with honor. Daniel Torres coaching 200 kids over 40 years, teaching them that strength doesn't require violence. Robert Hendricks saying 77 Japanese names every March 14th in a farmhouse in Nebraska. Jimmy Chen writing letters apologizing for deaths he caused, trying to be gentle enough to balance the weight. Yoshiro Tanaka teaching his granddaughter to remember without hatred, to honor all the dead enemy and friend alike. And somewhere in offices and academies and ships around the world, their legacy continues. Officers study the tactics, the 5-inch gun and the force-to-surface doctrine that changed submarine warfare. But fewer study the other lesson, the harder lesson, that every tactical innovation has a human cost, that efficiency in killing is still killing, that the men who perfect the art of war carry that perfection for the rest of their lives. That victory is measured not just in battles won, but in how the victors live with what they did to win. The ocean keeps its secrets. The depths hold the bodies of 1,500 Japanese submariners who died in 6 months because their leaders underestimated American innovation. History records it as a triumph of technology and tactics. But the men who did the killing, the survivors who carried the weight, they understood the truth. There are no clean victories, no battles without cost, no efficiency in death that doesn't mark the soul. And the greatest honor we can give the dead, all of them, on both sides, is to remember, to carry their names, to refuse to forget that they were human beings with lives and families and dreams, to understand that war is sometimes necessary, but it is never glorious. And those who fight it best are those who understand its true cost, not in ships sunk or battles won, but in the weight carried by men like Torres and Hendricks and Chen and Tanaka. Men who killed efficiently and spent the rest of their lives learning to be human again. That is the real story of the last hunt, not how 1,500 men died, but how the survivors learned to live.